It's my great pleasure and honor this morning to introduce Karen Mundy, who's our next keynote speaker. She is the Associate Dean of Research and a Canada Research Chair at the Ontario Institute for Studies in Education, University of Toronto, and the Vice President of the Comparative and International Education Society. Her research is focused on the global politics of education for all programs and policies, educational policy and reform in sub-Saharan Africa, the role of civil society organizations in educational change, and global citizenship education in Canadian schools. She is a prolific writer with 4 books and dozens of articles, chapters, and reports. She is also committed to playing an active role in policy dialogue about education and international development, most recently acting as a member of the External Steering Committee, guiding the evaluation of the Global Partnership in Education, and as a member of an external expert panel reviewing the World Bank's education activities in Africa. I'm very excited about her presentation today, thinking about ethnography, multilateralism, comparative education. So I'll hand it over to her, and after that we'll invite our discussant, Professor of Anthropology and Education, Charles Harrington, to provide some comments, and then we'll open it up to question and answer. So welcome.
Hi, everybody. I'm going to break a cardinal rule taught to me by Professor David Tyack, which is to never present us or something new or put in a grant that doesn't already have a conclusion to the research. So this is going to be on my part, quite a lot of new thinking. And I'm especially thrilled to be in a room with lots of ethnographers and people who have studied anthropology, because I'm going to draw in a couple of places on the anthropological sciences. Some of you may know that I was trained as a sociologist, very much in the critical theory school of sociology. So you'll see some of that, but you'll also see the increasing influence of organizational sociologies in my work. I wanted to talk today and begin by saying a few words about framing work on global politics of education as a problem of global governance. When I started writing about this, about 15, or maybe a little more than 15 years ago, if I walked into a room of political scientists and said, well, I'm interested in global governance, they would laugh me out of the room, because from their point of view, what I was talking about was a normative state that was unlikely to be achieved in a world of power. That changed very quickly after 1995. And this is the UN Commission on Global Governance, which first framed the term global governance for a broader policy public at a time when also the academic world was catching up and starting to use the term global governance. What I like about the term global governance is that it allows us to infuse or add a normative inflection to our empirical work. And the reason for this is that it allowed the language of global governance, as Barnett and Duval state, conjures up the very possibility and the desirability of effecting progressive change in global life through the establishment of a normative consensus and a collective purpose. And I think that frame has very much infused all of my work, but it's a challenge. The challenge is to describe empirically, while at the same time understanding a very large set of normative processes and the possibility or prospects of that kind of normative consensus. So the problem. I framed it in my very first paper in 1998 as a problem of understanding world order and understanding the political dynamics among different types of actors that are constituting world order. And in the study of education as one dimension of this global governance frame, we've seen quite a heavy evolution especially through comparative education research, from what initially were really single organizational case studies describing the evolution of the policies of those organizations, and primarily focusing or using methodologies of discursive analysis. That is, very much focused on the language and the content of the organizations, and reading from that both the culture of the organizations and the type of impact or effect they were likely to have. From that, we've seen a branching off to studies that actually try to trace, as Leslie Bartlett's work and Gita's work does, tries to trace the movement of policy ideas from global actors to the receptors, to the pickup among countries that are the clients of those actors. We've also seen an increasing number of studies of non-governmental actors who have proliferated over the last decades, as Frank has mentioned, and looking then at their ability to either build back a new conversation about global governance from the base or reframe the received wisdoms of global actors. I think today, if I could say what I think is missing, it is coming back to this notion of, well, so what? What is then, how do we understand the shape of a global order? And I'm going to talk about this by using some of the work I've done more recently on the World Bank. And I want to suggest a couple of things. If you walked out of this room, I guess I'd like you to think carefully about whether the terminologies, the very concepts we've used, the terminology of globalization, neoliberalism, whether in a rapidly changing global order, these are going to give us the purchasing power, the analytic power we need to understand the shape and the processes that construct our global order. I was thrilled about a month ago to find a book that encapsulated the various methodologies and theoretical frameworks that have infused my work on both civil society actors and international organizations. And it's a book by Neil Fligstein and Doug Adams called A Theory of Fields. A Theory of Fields builds on social movement theory, which is a very important set of theories trying to explain how non-state actors come to challenge, very effectively challenge, dominant or hegemonic discourses by not only mobilizing material resources, but also often, and perhaps predominantly, using ideological resources. Historical institutionalism, which is the study of state formations and how different state formations emerge around particular social settlements or political settlements, but also asking the question, how do these social settlements come apart or face rupture? And then sociological institutionalism. Admittedly, sociological institutionalism has tended to focus primarily on the way in which the grammar of high modernity in bureaucracies proliferates across organizations. And it hasn't tackled as much the question of change or rupture. But in this book, all of these ideas are captured, I think it would be fair to say, drawing also on Bourdieu, though without some of the French flair, trying to ask the question, what's the thing that holds together all these theories of society? And the conclusion that Fligstein and McAdam come to is that all of these theories of society hinge on the notion that there are actors operating in fields that are fairly well structured or differentiated, to use the Luhmann language, but also that these actors struggle to capture or to convince others towards collective action. So we think of a series of fields that shapes the resources and provides us ideological scripts or a grammar for action, but also of individual actors operating in these fields and in fact trying to reconstruct or merge different parts of the fields in ways that draw a larger consensus around specific ideas. And you can see here in this notion the link back to the notion of global governance as a normative endeavor or a normative process. So here's their definition. We define strategic action as an attempt by social actors to create and maintain stable world orders, social orders, by securing the cooperation of others. Strategic action is about control in a given context. The creation of identities, political coalitions, and interests serves to promote the control of actors vis-a-vis other actors. I want to talk a little bit, I'm not going to go into great detail about that, but I want to just say a few words about what this theory of fields might mean for the way we think about international organizations. And again, as I've mentioned, these are kind of preliminary thoughts. The first is that international organizations are embedded in fields of action that have been structured through previous rounds of collective action. I've made a very strong case in some of my earlier work that you couldn't possibly understand, for example, international aid to education without understanding the post-Second World War political settlement and, perhaps even more importantly, the balance of power between the US, or the West, and the Soviets, which engendered a kind of global discourse about redistributive multilateralism that then became the task of international organizations. That is to say that it was not only a story of hegemonic incorporation of Southern countries or societies into the West, it was also about the construction of Western notions of the good society, so that both things were happening in the foreign aid regime. But this theory of action fields also gives us a way of thinking about IOs as strategic actors in their own right, that they are constrained by institutional routines, and that they also operate in fields in which there is always the possibility of competition for other actors. It also provides us or provokes us to think a bit more culturally about the organizations and their behaviors. If these IOs' main job is to try to organize and shape collective action by drawing on existing institutions and resources, then they're likely to be more than just, as Foucauldian critics have described, organizations or bureaucracies that see like states, that try to enhance the legibility of other societies so that they can be acted upon. They're going to be a much more the relationship is going to be much more dialogic than that set of theories could capture. They're going to be much more than about enacting world culture, extending world culture. They're just going to be about more than hegemonic incorporation. The Fligstein and Adams book actually asks us to think about organizations as bricoleurs. And for those of you who know Levi-Strauss, you'll know that when Levi-Strauss described bricolage, he was describing a kind of pragmatic set of behaviors in which actors pull from existing material and put them together. It's not about means and ends, like I want to get to here in order to achieve this. It's more, I've got a problem, what are the resources around that I can pull together to provide an answer or a solution to that problem? And I'm going to talk about this later, but it seems to me that we're much better off if we frame the work of an organization like the World Bank as a problem of bricolage than a problem of hegemonic incorporation. So if you see IOs as bricoleurs, they are not epiphenomena of wider processes or power. They're actors in their own right. They are not simply means and strategic rationalists, but they're rather players in strategic fields of action whose underlying drive is to induce cooperation and collective action in ways that stabilize and give structure to world order. They're very much the active creators of new action frames who perhaps are defining new strategic fields of action. I said to Tony today, he's really great at drawing, visualizing, drawing great diagrams with different scales of action, and this is a very rudimentary table. It doesn't come up to Tony's high standards. But what I wanted to capture was that in thinking about world order, one might imagine 3 levels or 3 scales of activity. At the very, top scale is the geopolitical order and interstate system, defined primarily by power among states, but also the grammar of that power, which gets institutionalized in a series of organizations and rules. We might say that the underlying grammar of post-Second World War II world order was liberal institutionalism, right? Was liberalism, both phases of liberalism, economic liberalism, redistributive liberalism, and a notion of the individual as the primary actor in human society. It's a little bit of a misnomer to understand the geopolitical order as only a society of states. We know that. It's changed very dramatically, but I think it never has only been a society of states. Certainly today, we would have to admit that the society of states, the interplay of geopolitical power, is fundamentally being transformed by forms of economic and social power that transcend state interests. At the bottom, we have state formations. I like to conceptualize states as political settlements. The accretion of collective action over many cycles, combining with the institutional impetus to formalize and stabilize a society, constructs very distinct historical patterns within the state, and these states then generate normative scripts that get picked up and, when there's a political hegemon, extended or expanded across the whole world system. That would be the story I would give of post-Second World War liberal institutionalism. It's a complicated story because, of course, that liberal institutionalism went through several phases. The phase when there was real threat from the Soviets, a phase in which we might say pressure to ask the questions that socialism claimed to answer predominated, so redistributive multilateralism, a period when the Soviet threat was declining. That period, a period of simple adjustment, incorporation into a world economy, and then a period probably since about 2000 where liberal internationalism, the idea of one system with a single hegemon, not really a great balance of power, but the US at the core, supported by the West, and a proliferation of many, many actors with strong action positions, in part made possible because of a mono or a monopolar world order. So I want to talk about this a little bit in relation to the work that I've been doing over a long time on the World Bank. I was reminded when I see Peter Mucha, I don't know if he realizes it, but I have interview transcripts going back to about 1998, including with Peter. So I have this very long historical archive of interviews and programmatic documents that I follow very carefully, and am now working on a book on the World Bank and education for all. So how to understand the bank as what I'm going to say the preeminent global governor of education, at least until fairly recently. First of all, the bank created at the end of the Second World War as part of a post-World War II settlement with the US at the center. The US is a very interesting actor in global governance, right? Because it sets up institutions, but it never joins them. It just asks others to follow those rules. So the bank created as the economic part of the liberal institutions with the IMF, UNESCO as the educational branch, and the UN, of course, as the political arch of this settlement. But over time, the political arms falter, and the economic branches of this global governance order begin to take over more and more of the interface between nation states. That is, they become the anchor institution of a world order. Education emerges in the bank pretty late, actually, 1970s, really taking off in the 1980s. And one can explain the takeoff only by understanding the internal culture of the bank and the broader opportunities, political opportunities for the bank in that period. So the internal culture of the bank has always heavily emphasized the discipline of economics. People in the bank will often describe what's going on there as a continuous effort to get agreement from outside the education sector that education is important. And in the 1980s and early 1990s, around the technology and techniques of human capital theory, they had a winning proposition. So a constituted framing of education inside the bank helped to rise it up the agenda. But at the same time, in the context of debt in developing countries, a need or an opportunity for the bank to work with the notion of human capital alongside structural adjustment. So the bank, under a great deal of pressure to show that it isn't only about macroeconomic adjustments, but also about human development, has two resources at its hand by the late 1980s. It has human capital theory, which can guide investment in education, and it has education, which can be an answer to the human problem of structural adjustment. The bank is a bricoleur. I've said that. We should think about these organizations as bricoleurs. And I think one can demonstrate that by looking at how the bank then framed the value of basic education at the time of the Jomtien conference to become, in effect, the lead global actor. It wasn't UNESCO, it was not UNICEF, but it was, in fact, the bank that came forward with both a rational or a logical argument for investment, as well as the ability to generate resources in a way that could come into some effect. I understand the bank as then having very, very effectively married the two tensions in a world order dominated by liberal internationalism. And that is the notion of economic freedom and the notion of human freedom. And I just have a quote here that I always like to use to capture the way in which the bank is able to think about education as a problem for global governance. The expansion of educational opportunity, which can simultaneously promote income equality and growth, is a win-win strategy that in most societies is far easier to implement than the redistribution of other assets, such as land or capital. This notion that one can redistribute through education what would be too difficult to redistribute through other economic means, I think really was the winning card for the bank as it rose in the global governance regime. Of course, this is Maxwell, a critic from the Overseas Development Institute's response. A crude characterization of the current approach is to encourage internal and external trade to liberalize and simultaneously invest in health, education, and good governance so that people can take advantage of new economic opportunities. In other words, a very thin notion of global governance is at play here. It's a notion of global governance that hinges on building capacity, but not redistributing resources. The bank is a very skilled actor, and Fligstein and Adams use this notion of skill to describe the way actors actually come to shape and constitute social action fields. So how is it skilled? Well, it draws on repertoires of bureaucratic efficiency, economic prudence, scientific rationality, and methodological nationalism. Very, very effectively, more effectively than any other global governance actor in the education sphere. It marries the notion of individual opportunity, equality, and economic competitiveness. Equity and growth go hand in hand. And it sells its own role as being at the center of coordination of global action in the area of education. I was really profoundly amazed in the early 2000s when the head of the Global Campaign for Education told me, well, really, the World Bank is the only train leaving the station. It's the organization we must cooperate with if we want to achieve education for all. I actually also think that this was actually accurate. It was the only train leaving the station. Just to give you a sense of the effect inside the bank, this is just the percentage of total bank lending devoted to education over time, and you can see that it's been well over 4%, but it peaked very, very heavily just at the tail end of the structural adjustment era, and then again after the Dakar and MDG summits. coming down a little bit in the last couple years. I don't know if it's a long enough period to make a trend, but yeah. But then I want to ask a question, and this is something that has troubled me. And you all know that if you go to a Comparative Ed Society meeting and you put in the title of your panel, the World Bank, you just pack out the room and everybody comes to talk about the evil bank. I've always wondered from the interviews and the triangulation between policy statements and policy practices, how evil or how hegemonic the bank actually is. And I've always doubted that it deserved quite the reputation that it has at comparative education conferences. And I got a chance to test this or probe this a little bit 2 years ago when the Soros Foundation or the Open Society Foundations asked us to do a piece of research on the way in which the bank engages with the notion of the private provision of education. I don't think there's any topic that could be more iconically neoliberal and more criticized in the work of the World Bank than its role in promoting the privatization of putatively public services. We did a very careful study. We looked at all the bank's projects over a 5-year period. We looked at the policy discourse, the policy framing. We interviewed actors throughout the bank, quite a cross-section. And we looked not only at the core bank, the IBRD, the International Bank for Reconstruction and Development, and IDA, the International Development Association, but also the International Financial Corporation. And here's what we could see. A lot of policy entrepreneurs inside the bank seeking collective momentum and consensus on the idea that private services are inherently superior to public services. Often using very, very strong internal repertoires. So for example, economists who think primarily about incentives and whose social metaphors revolve around notions of rational individual actors in markets tend to prefer or tend to see privatization as a reasonable option. But when you look at the actual projects, the way the bank spends money on education, what it loans for, you find out that almost no projects have any private component. And the one private component that receives perhaps the most attention in policy documents from 1995 forward, vouchers, doesn't exist in any of the projects that we reviewed. If a bank doesn't hold together, if its policy talk and policy action look so different, one then I think can begin to ask the question, how skillful is it in building consensus? It may be very skillful. It's a bricoleur after all. It picks the things that it can push together in ways that build the strongest possible consensus for its future work. But on the other hand, it'll be difficult for an organization to claim to be a rational bureaucracy when its policy talk and policy actions diverge. This piece of work that we've done, I think now needs a lot more country level, backward mapping from the country level to understand why it is that the policy entrepreneurs in the bank don't have receptor audiences in the countries that the bank delivers aid to. Well, I mean, I have to end here. I don't know how many of you saw this last week. It just blew me away one morning while I was listening to the radio and having a shower. This is the 5th BRICS Summit. You know, there's different acronyms, BRICS, basics, but this was actually the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa meeting together. It's the 5th time that they've come together. It's an alternative summit to the G20 summit. What did they announce? Does anyone know?
A new version of the World Bank.
Right. So the BRICS are going to form their own bank. I read very carefully through the proposal and also their statement. It has, you can word search education, you won't find it in the current framing for their bank. But nonetheless, something is going on here that looks very different. And this is the piece that, to me, makes it even more imperative that we think of international organizations as bricoleurs. So much of our discourse in comparative education has, in a way, been navel-gazing about the contradictions or the pathologies internal to liberal internationalism. But we're now entering a world order in which, well, as one scholar wrote, there is the possibility of imagining a world without the West, or at the very least, multilateral organizations that work around the Western institutions. There's a lot of debate about how this is going to play out. So there's the workaround theory. There's also, I think, some fairly solid evidence that that workaround is actually happening. Patterns of trade see a lot of cohesion and movement into blocks of non-OECD countries, as rather between non-OECD and OECD countries. When you look at voting power in the UN and the way votes are taken, you see that the countries in play, that is the non-OECD countries, are now voting more like one another than like OECD countries. So one possibility is a workaround, a totally different world order being formed by a different bloc with, I might say, very different repertoires, very different normative views. And the other possibility is often presented as these two alternatives is hegemonic incorporation, and there's some good evidence that hegemonic incorporation into liberal institutions is happening. We know that China is rising in active engagement with the World Bank. Most recently, a funny story, the Anglo-American countries asked the bank to cut the salaries of World Bank staff to make it more competitive, and China and India said, no, 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 no. We want this to be a premier organization which actually offers the best possible advice to us, so we actually want you to invest more. We want the bank to have higher salaries. The BRICS were actually quite powerless to change the voting power, their voting power in the bank, and they did not succeed. They were not able to form a coalition to shape the decision to have a non-American as the new president of the bank. So there's some reasons to think that. I tend to imagine that we're going to see a little bit of both. We're going to see some workaround. We're going to see some efforts by these new countries, these new societies to shape our global institutions, and that this is a context that's going to produce more of the behavior of a bricoleur and less the behavior of a hegemon. Some final thoughts. Well, as changing geopolitical system is going to open new strategic action fields, that's basically the summary. When we see these new global actors, not just non-state actors, which have been proliferating, but actually new state actors, a good possibility that, in fact, liberal internationalism itself will no longer be the frame in which that sense of normative or progressive change is defined. Just some thoughts. If you're going to focus on or do research on global actors, I think it's imperative that you think of them as operating in strategic action fields and as trying to induce coordination, asking what repertoires and what frames are they using to do so. Which are the most skillful? Are they bricoleurs? Is that the right imagery for interrogating the work of IOs? I'm thinking it is. Don't accept or create a story about success before you've actually empirically tried to understand the nature of that success. And so too much in our field in comparative education, we assume success because we see an organization at the apex and because it has communicative capacity, the capacity to shape policies. But we don't ask the question, I think Frank asked it, is whether the policy ends up enacted in practice. And if it doesn't, then how come? So get a little more complicated about the notion of power wielded by IOs. But I want to just come back again to that first slide and say, to me, when we look at these IOs, it's imperative that we also think about them. Think about them in a global governance frame. Think about the power that is being used to construct a normative frame, a normative consensus about our collective purpose. So that's the end of what I want to say, but I have to do some advertising. So please come to Toronto next year. We'll have lots of sessions on the World Bank for people to populate and other international organizations. I'm hoping that I can draw some economists back into the conversation. They've almost been utterly absent from comparative education for a long while. I'd like to see a really strong interdisciplinary conversation at CIS, and it's a good time to contact me if you have thematic or other ideas for how to make it really the best comparative ed conference in a decade. Is that enough marketing?
So I'd like to invite Professor Charles Harrington up to share some remarks as our discussant, and then we'll open the floor to questions and answers.
So I'm to play the role of house anthropologist, which in this context can turn into house curmudgeon. I was struck by both papers this morning about certain assumptions that I'd just like to spend a moment talking about. There was a distinction made during discussion this morning about the difference between theory and the real world. And I think that's a place that anthropologists spend a lot of their time, trying to look at what's going on out there in the field. There are a number of assumptions that were mentioned this morning. Causality was mentioned this morning in your paper about the assumption, but the whole notion of causality depends on interpretation. And it also depends, therefore, on where you start your observation. The same thing is true in communication research. When you talk about sender-receiver, these are interpretations. It depends on where you started to observe who becomes the sender and who becomes the receiver. And the same thing is true of teacher-student, the notion that teachers don't learn from students, or that students don't seek to manipulate the options available to teachers, but at the same time that teachers are trying to manipulate the options available to students, has an assumption of linearity to it that I think is worth questioning. When I come to the more recent paper, there's an implicit notion of actors who seem to be promoting their control over other actors, and there's the same sort of assumption of linearity, that the actors are somehow coming from outside or funded from outside, and the people being acted upon are somehow within the system. I'm not sure that's fair to you, but in the context that I just described, that sort of seemed appropriate. Another assumption coming to your paper, which I thought was very interesting, is the notion that we want to, here I have to preface this remark to say, you might find this a strange remark to come from someone who was a student of Talcott Parsons, but you say we have to examine the world order. My immediate response was, what about world disorder? And the notion about the fact that we have actors creating and promoting stable social worlds sounds to me remarkably similar to an earlier version of sociology that I was taught many years ago. So is another assumption in both papers, and that is that there's a normative structure which somehow informs collective purpose. And this sounds to me like an equilibrium model where you've got three different systems, and one of those systems is the normative system, which will drive the other systems. One of the difficulties about anthropology is that one of the consequences of doing ethnography is that you learn that one of the strengths of ethnography is to collect data on three different systems. One is what you can observe people doing. The other is what they say they're doing. And the other is what they say they ought to be doing. And woe to you, the ethnographer, if you ever confuse the three. Because I don't want to shock you, but people do not always do what they say they ought to do, nor when they tell you what they did, will they tell you what they actually did. because they tell you what you want to hear. So there's that interactive process again. So it's the ethnographer and the person being studied, but that's another interactive process, and one affects the other. It's called intersubjectivity in the jargon of my discipline. And the whole issue about that, and the issue about global governance, in my own research, I relate that to the political fights in this country and in Washington about educational policy, and how the assumption is once we've changed the law, then somehow we've taken care of the problem. And many years ago, when after a federal court decision, which mandated instruction in the native language in required subjects by all students, the federal government passed a law authorizing the creation of independent organizations, that is, in this case, general assistance centers, which contracts were given to universities to go out and help implement those laws. And I was the director of the first Lao Center in the Northeast. And in that role, I was taken by a very proud principal to see his new bilingual classroom, which he assured me in the hall represented a new age of understanding among peoples. For the first time, he said, people will be able to communicate in their own language. So I thought that was a bit extreme, but anyway. But he had the rhetoric right. And we got to the door, and he opened the door and called the teacher out. And he said, Professor Harrington, he'd like to observe your class today. And she said, oh, I'm sorry, you can't come in today. They were so rotten yesterday, I'm not speaking to them. and a rather nonplussed principal and I staggered down the hall. Now, besides pondering for a moment what the functional difference is in not speaking to them in two languages versus not speaking to them in one language, the whole issue about this was a classroom that was labeled bilingual education, so that the law has been, in a sense, implemented, unless, of course, you go in and watch what people do. School was also called integrated school. Yeah, there were 25% white kids, and that meant it integrated by the definition of that period. There were 6 classes in each grade. One of them was remarkably different from the others, and that's where the white kids were. So the assumption that it was integrated on the basis of outside structural characteristics and the actual reality of what ethnographers would see is a very different one. And I come to that, coming back to the UN and some of my concerns there. I was traveling in rural Transylvania with someone who was one of the chief educational officers and public relations officers for UNICEF. And she had been telling me during our drive about all the various countries in the world that she'd visited. And I was feeling very inferior as an anthropologist. I'm supposed to do all this, cross-cultural stuff, and she's been everywhere, And then the whole time we're out, if we stop for anything, she complains about the food, she complains about the fact that there's no toilet paper in the restrooms, but certain cultures you carry around. All of this goes, and I said, what is with this? And it turned out that she only lived in the Hyatt or Hilton Hotel in each of these countries that she was telling me all about. And her cross-cultural experience was, in fact, very useful if you were a hotel manager, a cross-cultural and comparative study of the Hyatts and the Hiltons in the various countries that she had visited. But she never got out of that framework. And I think that, so those are some of the concerns that I have, and also some of the things that you called for that I think ethnography would be very helpful to do. What actions work? Well, there's a big one. First, you have to figure out what the success definition would be, but on the ground, what's happening, and that comes back to some of the examples I gave. And again, one of your other points I resonate to is don't assume that because you've implemented a policy change or gotten, at some level, an organization with authority to do it, don't assume you've won the game, because everyone's going to tell you that it happened, but it didn't happen. I was once talking to the Vice Chancellor of CUNY, and there had been a new requirement by the state that all master's programs had to have a culminating experience. Remember that, colleagues? So I said to her, what are you going to do about that? And she said, well, if the state says we have to have a culminating experience, then we have it. And that was the end of that discussion. So thank you for your paper.
So maybe what we can do is group a few questions for Karen, and then if you'd like to respond to the comments as well with the group of questions, please come to the microphone. Yeah, if you have a question, just come. And state your name and your question as well.
Hi, my name is Vanya Salgado. I'm a student of the Masters, and I also work for the Global Partnership for Education, which has allowed me to understand how the World Bank operates. So I would like to know if you could reflect a little bit more on the gradation of stateness of these international organizations. I say this because I feel that sometimes we think of these international organizations at the international level, but sometimes the degree of decisions of the state level are very important. For instance, loans are negotiated at the political level between the institution and the governments, and the budget and the voting system of the World Bank depends on the states. But probably more importantly, this is something that we have discussed in Professor Gita's class. What's the role of the local elites in approaching and implementing the global agenda? So if you could say something about that.
Good morning, my name is Mirka Tversko. I'm a first-year doctoral student in the Comparative International Education program. My question is mainly about the issue of legitimacy. I was surprised not to hear a little bit more about that, and I'm wondering how Fligstein and Adam deal with legitimacy in their idea of a theory of fields and field actors. If we are to think more about it from an organizational theory or institutional theory point of view, legitimacy plays a huge role, not only in creating rational actions, but in also creating or making decisions and actions that legitimize your position. And I wanted to hear a little bit more about that. Thank you.
Perhaps we can take one more question and then give the floor back to Karen.
My question is in a way related to Vanya's. Oh, sorry. I'm Marishi Theory. I'm a second-year doctoral student, and I'm kind of looking at this issue in my dissertation research on how a global reform about contract teachers is playing out in the context of a couple of states in India. So my question is kind of related to that as well. You talked about the workaround at the global level. And when I'm looking at issues in India, I'm seeing that there are workarounds at the national and local level as well, where there's a policy that is supported by the national level, but there are workarounds at the local level, or which may or may not be completely related to what the global level is proposing. So the workarounds happen at different levels, and they build these coalitions with really opposite levels together. So I was just wondering what you're expecting to find when you start looking at the country aspect of it in the next part of your research.
Great. Do you want to respond some, and then if we still have time, sure, we can take some more.
So I'm really disappointed. No anthropologist stood up and told me that I shouldn't use a notion of bricolage in my work. So I'm waiting for that. Come on, I need some help here. I actually found it. I was thrilled when Fligstein used it. So, you know, first of all, just to say thank you to Charles, and that I do actually think that I have been very, very deeply informed by efforts of anthropologists to understand international organizations. So this notion of the gap between policy talk and policy action is very much foundational to the study of transnational political relations in the field of anthropology. So I'd like to do it more, and I think one of the pieces that most worries me when I look at the bank is trying to make sense or trying to find a way of framing the deep grammar of it as an organization. This is something that we often take too much for granted, but what we talk about neoliberalism as a set of constructs, policy constructs, but we don't talk about the culture of the bank and the ways of seeing that are produced by the bank in an anthropological sense. So it's something I'd like to do more of, and that I think others should do more of. You know, I suspect that what I'm going to find when I look at countries is a lot of different policy stories. And the theory of political fields is one of those grand theories. It says, what do all the theories of social action have in common? But it doesn't ask the question, what don't they have in common? Or at what scale do these things operate? Or even which one has power over the other? And this kind of leaves you with a bit of a mess. And I think Tony would agree, it's going to be almost impossible to diagram it. But, right? I mean, so what I expect to see is, one could say, crudely, a global level interfacing with the national level. I expect to see that would be in IO to state. But I also expect to see workarounds between local actors and other kinds of global actors, possibly other IOs. That is, they will seek legitimating frames in wherever they can find them. So they'll use those frames, legitimated frames from international actors, will be used by domestic actors to advance certain kinds of policy solutions. At the same time that the most powerful global actors are trying to impose, or actually I think the idea of imposing is the wrong concept. They're trying to sell. So what we have here is a problem in which different actors are trying not to impose, but to sell or to convince or to persuade. That is, they're trying to put on the table a set of proposals that actors domestically buy. And we shouldn't imagine that the domestic actors don't have another set of proposals with other repertoires or legitimated ideological sources to support what they want to do. That's not to say also that you're not going to find a lot of pure material politics. And I like that Charles raised the question of elites in international organizations, but also the question about what do I think I'm going to find from local elites. You know, one of the great and most interesting pieces about the wave of inclusion of children in schools that's happened at an unprecedented historical pace over the last decade is how tightly that wave has come in the wake of democratic transitions. Roughly put, it's easier to sell yourself in a political market through access than almost any other kind of social change. So now we know that. What we also should keep in mind is that it's going to be a lot harder to gain, once you get kids in school, it's going to be a lot harder to change what they learn or how they learn. In part because there's not a huge visible political gain from something like learning, which is a little difficult, not so tangible as getting a physical person in a seat. And elites have played very, very sophisticated games around education for all. So there's absolutely no question that not only vote buying occurs through provision of better material resources in education. That's only one piece of it, but that equity is not a likely outcome in political systems where there isn't a lot of popular voice. I mean, that's the other piece of the EFA problem. Now that's a very normative statement from somebody who's embedded in a liberal international world society, I think. But it does seem to me that we could look usefully back at the history of schooling in the Western world, not because, as modernization theory suggested, every society is going to follow the same pathway to modernization, but rather because it can help us to understand the kind of coalitions or the kinds of cross-class coalitions that produced public education. So if you've read Margaret Weir, you know that she makes a very profound argument about the importance of cross-class coalition in the construction of the US public education system. I think that kind of understanding that cross-class coalition, or the potential for that kind of cross-class coalition, is crucial in understanding the way in which societies take up global educational ideas, and where it is really patrimonial societies in which power is very much concentrated. I wouldn't expect global education ideas to move much beyond promises of education for all and more children in seats. So.
Chuck had something quick to say, and then we'll give the last word to Karen since we're at our time.
We need to, and this is spoken as someone who's spent 45 years teaching at a school of education, but we need to have some caution about the notion that educational change is easier to implement than change in the other parts of the world, and therefore is a place to start, because there are lots of examples that one can talk about, but there's Fran Varvis's work among others. But there is a real problem with that belief being confused with reality, and that if you change somehow the education system and open up, you've solved the problems of the economy and the polity. David McClellan years ago thought that if you change people's personality to make it more oriented toward need for achievement, that economic development would follow. It didn't. And then he wrote a book saying, oops, sorry about that. Because and that's a very Parsonian model too, when you think about it. But I think we have to be cautious that education offers the lever that will accomplish other things.
Do you want to take the last word? Or?
Well, I guess only to say that it's been really a pleasure to follow Gita's work and the work of all of Gita's students, and Leslie's and Fran's work as well. And I see a lot of intersections now that I'm starting to do the work backward mapping from the country level. I'm hoping to draw a lot more on that. And I still want somebody to talk to me about using the notion of bricolage and bricoleur in setting international organizations.
Great, thank you so much. That was a wonderful presentation and a great conversation.